So I came to a place where the Lord spoke to me and my wife, and we moved to a big city. We'd planted several churches, done crusades, done all sorts of things, but I had this desire to see movements of the gospel. So we moved to the center of this big city in South Africa, and it was me, my wife, my family, and we wanted to see a movement of the gospel. Well, pretty soon we had started a church like every other church, and we'd pretty much done what we knew to do. And I was pastoring a church for a couple of years, and the church started to grow and people started to join. But I was increasingly dissatisfied, and I was dissatisfied with the outcomes, the amount of energy that was going into it, and the amount of things that were happening just didn't seem to match to me. It seemed like I was the only one who had a passion for the kingdom. It seemed like I was the only one who was pushing with all this energy. And we had a growing base of members. We had a growing base of people that were coming to church. But that wasn't enough for me. And so I remember the one day I was preaching a sermon, and I'm talking to a group of people of this growing church. And while I'm talking, in my mind, I go up outside the building and I start to look down on where we are. And at that stage, we were in the center of a city that's 10 million people at that point in time. Today, it's 14 million people. And I looked down on the city, and I asked myself a question I'd never asked myself before. I asked myself, what would it take to reach the city? Now, as a pastor, as a good pastor, up until that point, I'd been asking, what will it take to grow my church? But this, I realized, was fundamentally a totally different question. I realized that what will it take to reach your city and what will it take to grow your church are two completely different questions. Today I say to pastors that if you want to grow your church, you probably will never reach your city. But if you focus on reaching your city, your church will probably grow. And so we began to change everything that we did. We actually closed the church down, and I don't recommend closing down churches. But we closed the church down. We were so desperate to see movements of the gospel. And we began to travel around the city and travel around the country, making disciples, but more importantly, not just making disciples, making disciple makers. We began to show people how to make disciples. And we began to multiply disciples. And pretty soon, after a couple of years, a few short years, we began to see disciple-making groups and churches multiply across the country, across the nation, and across probably about 10 different countries. And I say probably because it's very hard to track. But about 10 different countries around South Africa, we began to see movements of the gospel multiply. And so I think movements are critical because it's the only way that we will fulfill the Great Commission. We have to think in terms of multiplication. We have to think in terms of movements. We have to think about everything multiplying. We have to begin to think in a way that's completely different to some of the sterile methods that we use today. If we want to be relevant to the population growth worldwide, we need to learn how to multiply disciple makers that start new churches, train new leaders, and continue to multiply to reach entire nations.